All right, second up, I'm going to be talking about the Change and Suppression Conversion Practices Prohibition Bill 2020. A word salad, a mouthful, but it is effectively this issue of LGBT conversion therapy. That is the name of a bill that is introduced this week into the Victorian Parliament. Victoria is the second most populous state of Australia for those watching from overseas. Search our YouTube channel for my conversion therapy commentary from the past, particularly one from last season. But I want to speak about it again with extra clarity because Victoria has raised the bar with this latest bill introduced into the Parliament this week. I've read a lot about the bill. I haven't read the detail of the bill, but I'm pretty sure I understand what's in it based on what I've read about it and the information we've been given. It is a bill which, as the title says, note the change and suppression. Change and suppression. It's purporting to outlaw change and suppression practices. It's a bill that prohibits change. It's a bill that prohibits suppression, and the other word in there is a bill that prohibits conversion. Now, it will be falsely marketed as a bill that prohibits torture and coercion and abuse. And it'll be falsely justified based on a report that was given to the Victorian government by the Human Rights Law Centre and La Trobe University, which claims that such things are rife in Christian and religious communities, that is, torture, coercion and abuse. I quote from the report, "Harmful conversion practices emerged in conservative Christian communities in the 1970s. Our research suggests that conversion practices and ideologies are being mainstreamed within particular Christian churches. Conversion activities can constitute torture or cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, particularly when they are administered through force or to children." They go on to make the outrageous claim that up to 10% of LGBT Australians are vulnerable to these harmful practices, that is, torture and etc., degrading treatment, cruelty, because 10% of Australians attend religious institutions like Protestant churches. I mean, it's a huge leap. Let me be clear, these are lies. Abusive, coercive treatments of LGBT people were as much a part of mainstream medicine as they were of any religious communities. These things were done in government institutions. But there's a bigger issue. None of these things are happening anywhere in Australia today. Full stop, end of story. It's a sham. It isn't even true. In fact, successive governments have admitted that. Queensland admitted it. South Australia's admitted it. The ACT have admitted it. Not happening. No evidence. So what does the bill do? Well, I go back to where I was a moment ago. What does it actually do? The words change, suppression, conversion. Those words are important. And examples that are given in the aforementioned report include churches that state, quote, change is possible. Churches that have a, quote, welcoming but not affirming stance. Churches that are, quote, saturated with an exclusively heterosexual ideology. As if sexuality is an ideology, right? It's called biology, creation. The idea that same-sex attracted people are committed to celibacy. Discussions in faith-based settings between freely consenting adults. Scripture reading. Prayer. Let me be clear. These things could constitute crimes punishable by imprisonment. We asked during a briefing with the government a few questions. We asked whether a parent with a gender dysphoric child would be engaging in criminality for encouraging their child to embrace their biological sex. They couldn't give us an answer. So a parent who is apprehensive about putting their child on hormones and potentially ruining their life by chopping up their body who is apprehensive about that for good common sense and scientific reasons, namely that most children grow out of it, they might be criminalising themselves. We asked whether a fully mature, grown adult could voluntarily seek support from like-minded individuals, or maybe a pastor or a counsellor. Now, these group sessions where people who get together, who want to get together, they happen. If they want to control their LGBT inclinations, because that's what they want for themselves. Again, the government couldn't give an answer. Would they be encouraging criminality? So apparently anyone can live out their identity without judgment or restriction unless they're a Christian. Right? If you want to live as a Christian first, you can't. You can't seek the help that would allow that, because that would be encouraging criminals. That's not to mention medical practitioners who don't want to rush to affirmation but want to check for underlying causes. That's not to mention pastors who just preach the Bible. there's a number of other scenarios I could come up with, all concerning. I mean, the question that arises to me is, who does the Victorian government even think that they are? They've never met these parents. They've never met their children. They've never met the LGBT Christian who wants to live as a Christian first. They know nothing about them. And yet they decree on threat of prison what is best for that person, regardless of who that person is or what that person wants. This is just about outlawing change. It's about outlawing suppression, or indeed even seeking self-control. It's insane. Or it's actually evil. Here is a statement released this week by the Victorian Premier. He says this is Daniel Andrews. Cruel and bigoted practices that seek to change or suppress a person's sexual orientation or gender identity will soon be stamped out across Victoria thanks to new laws introduced to Parliament today. Well, firstly, cruel and bigoted practices were ended a long time ago, and it wasn't thanks to Daniel Andrews. This is just rhetoric to hide what's actually within the bill. He goes on, the bill denounces such practices as deceptive and harmful, reinforces that ideology behind these practices is flawed and wrong. Now, if you define these practices as everything that the bill covers, and then you say, well, what's the ideology behind these things that I've just been talking about the parents and the counselling and the pastors and all this kind of stuff? What's the ideology? It's called Christianity. That's the ideology. It's called the Bible. It's called parents' rights to raise their kids according to their moral and religious values. That's the ideology that's flawed and wrong, according to Mr. Andrews. He goes on, responses to reports will be survivor-led and trauma-informed, focusing on community education and facilitation. This will ensure that any response meets the needs and wishes of the affected person. Do you know, I've read, and I don't want to have a go at anybody, except this is a fact. I've read the 15 survivor testimonies in the report that I mentioned before, and the individuals here, whilst they say what they went through hurt them, they did not survive coercion or abuse. They're not survivors of torture. They're survivors of having once gone to church and very much disliking the doctrine, or having once gone to a voluntary consenting support group and having thought better of it afterwards, or having disagreed with their parents over their sexuality and having later been upset by it or been upset by it at the time. Those are the sorts of things that they are survivors of. And that's the extent of it. Let's not overstate this and say that this is all about torture. It isn't. And I'm sorry that they felt that these ideas were hurtful and harmful to them. But here's the thing. You don't have to go to church. You don't have to go to these groups. Some people like it. Some people want it. You don't have to, and you left. And that's how it should work. It's called a free world. Not to mention, there are huge numbers of people in Christian churches who used to identify as LGBT but no longer do. And there are increasing numbers of people who used to identify as transgender and no longer do. And it's been Christians that have... I know a guy here in Australia who was a trans woman for a number of years and then detransitioned, and he was dropped like a hot potato by the trans community for doing that. And it was Christians who picked up the pieces. And he joined a church, and he's a great fella. And he now sees that what he did, he disagrees with what he did. He disagrees with the life that he lived. And he wants to, and he couldn't be happier about living the life that he's living now as a Christian. These people are real. There's heaps of them. They couldn't be happier about it. And they're erased by this bill. The life they want to live, it will be illegal for people to seek that life if this bill passes. I repeat, who does the Victorian government think they are to live these people's lives for them? Andrew says this bill also puts in place strong criminal sanctions for people who subject others to change or suppression practices that cause injury or serious injury, with up to 10 years jail for the latter. Those who try to get around the new laws by subjecting people to change or suppression practices which cause injury outside of Victoria could face a jail term of up to 2 years, while advertising these practices will incur a criminal sanction and a maximum fine close to $10,000. So this is where we are. The risk here is, and it's not even a risk, it's true, that the gospel itself, parts of it, parts of the Bible itself and pastoral ministry and responsible parenting and good medical care, parts of all of these things are set to become potentially jailable offences. We're actually here, we've arrived. Now, it won't happen immediately. I don't think that's how it works. These laws tend to sit on the books for a while, and they'll sit there until culture changes a little further, and then they'll be used for the first time by an activist to attack some fringy case that it's hard to defend, because they'll be waiting for it and waiting for it. It could take 5 years to happen, but it'll happen. And then they'll be used more and more and more to attack truth and attack people who have done nothing wrong. That's how these things work out. You know, I recall doing an interview for 60 Minutes on this subject of conversion therapy. And this part didn't go to air, but I remember asking the journalist, I said, what if all that is good and right, what if true joy and peace and happiness, what if those things weren't actually to be found within a person's identity or within a person's inner self? What if this whole mantra of identity, of self-discovery, of pride, what if it's all exactly backwards? What if I'm not actually God? What if worshipping and serving the inner self, the creature, as Romans 1:25 says, what if that's not my destiny? What if that's not what's right and good and best for me? What if, in fact, God, whom I should serve and submit to, is not inside of me, but it is outside? He is outside of me. What if he is transcendent? What if all that is good and right, what if true joy and peace and happiness are to be found outside of myself in God alone? And what if a life enslaved to self and its passions and desires is a life of misery, a life of shame? One that you have to compensate for, frankly, by shouting about pride, waving rainbow flags at people and suing them for saying things you don't like. What if, actually, the converse of that is a life that's liberated from self? A life that's alive to God, reconciled to God, and submitted to His will and purpose. And what if that was true freedom? What if that brought peace to the heart? What if that was actually joy? As Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. What if, as Jesus says, you know, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. The truth will set you free. You know, it's not what if, it's actually true. We are those who are made to worship and serve the Creator, not the creature, to use the language as Romans 1:25. The answer is not in self-worship, but it is in being reconciled instead to God through the cross of Jesus Christ and worshipping and living for Him. And I know that many, I really do know this actually, it's some of the more difficult times in my life have been spent reading documents to this effect. I know that many an LGBT person suffers a lot of mental anguish. I know that the mental health outcomes are bad and make really tough reading. I know that suicide rates are high. I've read papers on the subject, I've heard many testimonials, and it's a hard read. Because every time I do it, I read stories from people who are repressed in themselves and very unhappy. Now, I've been told that by gay activists. It's not just my words. I've read that in the reports authored by people like the Human Rights Commission. I'm here to tell you this, banning conversion therapies won't solve any of that. It won't. Jesus will solve that. He stood up to speak his first sermon in Luke's Gospel, and he said that he had come to set free those who are oppressed. And he did that by taking our sin on himself, which is the thing that oppresses us, our slavery to ourselves and the passions and desires of the self. And he nailed that to his own cross. He suffered under the judgment of it. And hear his words in Matthew chapter 11. He says, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you." In other words, submit to me, not self, but me. Learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Now that's the truth. And if Daniel Andrews wants to call that bigoted quackery and wants to send me to jail for it, well, I guess I'll have to go to jail with half the Christians in Victoria, because there is no way you can expunge that message and that truth, because it is the gospel and it's never been expunged before, despite people's best efforts. To quote the apostles in the book of Acts, when the ancient anti-discrimination tribunal, the Sanhedrin, told them to shut their mouths and stop speaking, they said, we must obey God rather than men. I'm Mark Niles, and that was the truth of it. Hey, one more thing. You know, I've been looking at the metrics and I figured out something. You guys are watching the videos and not subscribing. So please help us out a great deal by hitting the like button and then hitting subscribe, hitting the bell as well so you get the notifications. It helps us out a really great deal, and you can click here to see more videos.